This morning, I'm going to do the fourth installment of our Stones series, Stones That Stories Tell. And it will culminate in Easter with a message I'm calling Reunited. You know, who doesn't want to be reunited with someone that they love? And so the Easter story is a story of being reunited. The tagline is really torn veils and rolling stones. The veil and the stone is what brought the separation. Or at least it's what represented the separation. It represented the separation of us and God and the separation from death and life. And yet in that one event, crucifixion and resurrection, with that event, the separation between us and God is gone. We're reunited. And this barrier of death and life is obliterated because we experience Christ now and we'll experience him on the other side of that experience as well. So, I think it was last year I came across some really amazing statistics. And the gist of them is what I remember. The numbers I don't. It was just there's a high percentage of people that if invited to church on Easter, they would come. See, Easter is a cultural holiday now, right? And I don't care if it's jelly beans or egg hunts or chocolate bunnies. If someone's more receptive to an invitation to come to church on Easter, I want a part of it, right? And then the unique stat was that there was a high majority of people that said that they didn't go to church on Easter in this survey, but they would have if someone would have invited them. Isn't it amazing? Now, I know some of you have come in by yourself. You come to church by yourself. There's been no kind of invitation from someone here. And you guys are rock stars that you kind of take that kind of chance and come. And many people, though, one invitation by a friendly face can be a life change for them. So I encourage you to, even now, think about who does God have you in their circle? And not just see every interaction as random. Maybe God has someone in your circle that he wants you to invite to experience Easter with you. So we've gone through You Are Not an Underdog out of the David scripture and the 5 stones. We've talked about drop stones, hold grace from the John chapter 8 passage that dealt with the woman caught in adultery. Dig down to build up, and that was unique, right? Because here in 1 week, if you don't drive by on this road, you left last week and there was nothing, and you came by this week and there's all the steel up. We talked about in order to go up, you gotta dig down, and that was from Luke. And today we're going to talk about altars alter everything. Altars alter everything. An altar is where our transcendent, our mysterious, all-knowing, can't wrap your brain around, can't put him in a box. Our transcendent God becomes immanent. He becomes touchable. It's where he reveals himself. It's where he can be known. And it's at an altar where it's an elevated place of sacrifice where the divine and the human meet. An altar. It's an interaction with God that changes everything, ourselves, our current circumstances. It even changes our future. Alter with an E means to change, means to adjust. And so everything then is everything that gets touched between us and God at an altar, at an elevated place of worship and sacrifice. It changes everything. Altars just don't happen on their own. Altars are intentionally built. We build the altar, and it's God that does the altering. Altars are worship moments of movement that create momentum for the future. In reflecting over a conversation I had with actually 2 people after the first service, 2 different people describing to me just what their past experience has been with altar and how even in this message it kind of helped change and reframe that for them. But when I started thinking about altars, every major thing that's happened in my life has started in an altar. Every significant change, anything significant new, began in an altar. In the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, there's a lot of talk about building altars, but also about tearing altars down. in the Old Testament. Gods were more known and more recognized as kind of territorial gods, in the sense that there was a place and a people that God was kind of relegated to and confined in. Israel worshiped Yahweh. Yahweh, Jehovah, would have been recognized at the time as a wilderness God. From the time of Abraham through the time of Moses, God led Israel through wilderness, through dry places where they needed deliverance. It was a necessity for a powerful God. And yet, as they got around more people of other nations, and specifically where God was directing them to the land of Canaan, Canaan wasn't a wilderness. It wasn't a dry place. It was a place of abundance. Scripture just describes it as flowing with milk and honey. Even when the spies go in to check it out in the time of Moses, they came back carrying fruit that was so large that they were carrying it on poles that bent. It was a place of fertility. Well, Israel had never experienced that before. And so I think in their mind, the way they ended up worshiping and building other altars, they specifically, Old Testament will tell us about Baal and Asherah. And so you can see how God was concerned in the sense that warning them, when you enter into this new land, you have to be careful to stay away from their gods. Why? Because those gods were false gods. They were limited gods. And false gods and limited gods only bring falsehoods and limitations. But entering into this land, their brain shift was, well, Yahweh is a God of power and of deliverance here in the desert, but we're not in the desert anymore. We ain't Kansas no more. So maybe there is a need. Maybe there is some functionality. Maybe this would be a good thing for us to bring alongside these gods of this territory. And so God's warnings were really, really clear. You need to stay away from those other altars, those other gods. Why? Because at any time in our life when we build an altar to someone other than God, at the very best case scenario, it just sucks power away from us. The worst case scenario is it leads us down a destructive path. Right? So God's very clear all the way. Listen, I'm not just the God of the wilderness. Literally, there's a battle in the Old Testament where the battle is fought on the hills. And Israel wins. And the other army regroups and says, oh, well, their God must be a God of the hills. Next time, let's fight them in the valleys. And so they regroup. They take all the time necessary to gain another fighting group. They engage Israel in the valley and destroy it again. Why? Because God isn't just the God of a certain circumstance or certain area. He is the all-powerful, all-knowing, immanent, and transcendent God. So who we build altars to is sometimes, I would think, even more significant than what we do at the altar. And so although I'm not going to talk about tearing altars down today, I think in our culture of Jesus, and it bears witness that we all need to reflect on when we're talking about building altars. Are there altars that are taking away from the worship that happens at our altar and what can happen at altars with God, with Yahweh? So the first altar, actually I wrote the message around 3 altars. We got to 1 in the first service. Actually, I had 4 altars. I cut one before coming in this weekend, put it down to 3. We're going to get to 1. Guess what we're talking about next week? Altars alter everything. Let's talk about a big one. Let's talk about the trust altar. A trust altar. We find the story that I'm pulling this from out of Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 18. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there." He said, "We will worship and then we will come back to you." Out of this whole 18 verses I'm reading, this is the one that just jumps up and screams trust. Even with what he understood God had asked him to do, he still believed that there was going to be provision for something that's going to turn out differently than what he had anticipated. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son." "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." The two of them went up together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." There's a lot of language in this that translates, right, to John, the Gospels. Abraham looked up from there in a thicket. He saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Go back 10 chapters, and we have God's first interaction with Abraham. In that, he calls Abraham to leave where he was, leave his family, and go to a place that God was yet to even tell him where it was. Paul describes this moment in his book to the church at Rome. He says that when Abraham took up his family and left to move, that it was credited to him as righteousness. In other words, that Abraham had heard God's call to move, and in moving, then it cemented this relationship with God over this move. It was credited to him as righteousness before we even have Christ. God's promise to Abraham was plain. "From you, I will build a nation that will bring forth the Messiah." Fast forward to 10 chapters where we just read from. It's 25 years later. It's 25 years. And Isaac is his and Sarah's only son. And in that 25 years of maybe not a lot of movement, God calls him to bring that son up on the mountain. How old is Isaac? Scholars, historians can't really peg it. It's pegged anywhere from 8 to like 25. Here's my perspective on it. Abraham's 100 years old and he's taking his son with him. I don't think mama's letting him go if he's 8. I mean, that's just what I'm thinking. You know, your dad's 100 years old. You know, so he's taking care of his 100-year-old dad. The amount of wood that would have been carried up the mountain probably is not carried by a little boy. I think Isaac's older. Isaac walks up this mountain with Dad. Dad's had to think about the whole trip of what's going on. Isaac's also old enough to be aware that he knows what they're going to do, and they don't have everything necessary to do it with. When he gets to the top, and Isaac builds the altar, no doubt, Abraham's building the altar, no doubt Isaac's handing him some stones. No doubt Isaac's the one who carried the wood. Isaac's setting the wood on the altar. And then Abraham begins to tie his son up. We have no indication of any conversation. We have no indication of any struggle. Why is that? Isaac trusted his dad, and his dad trusted God. So Isaac is bound. He's laid on the altar. And when it's time to sacrifice his son, God provides another sacrifice. Wow, what a test. How did you approach tests in school? And some of you are still in school. If you know the answer, you really like to get in there and take the test, right? I've got 7 students in my class at Lee that I'm not quite sure they like tests. And I know they're not watching, so I don't care about saying it. But when you're not prepared, the anxiousness is pretty strong, right? Abraham is prepared. Sometimes we see tests, especially when we see tests from God, we see them as God. Why was it necessary for you to give me that test? And we see that from a standpoint of thinking, what are you trying to do to trip me up? This is not a test. God is not laying this test on Abraham to see, can I get Abraham to fail? And yet, many times you and I hit tests. We hit things where it's going to require a great deal of trust. And our tendency is, why me, why now? Why me, why now? What were you thinking, God, or were you not thinking at all? But the establishment of a trust altar has some significant impact on how we continue to live. One reason God asks us to build trust altars at critical junctions in our life is to reestablish our trust in Him. And it becomes an opportunity for Him to reinforce His promise to us. 25 years. 25 years. Over time is a way of causing us to doubt what we heard God say. Time has a way of eroding the passion for God's promises. Time has a way of lulling us in sleepy patterns of life that aren't moving us towards God's purposes. But altars alter everything. I say Abraham needed the moment. It's been 25 years. The need for the promise of God. The words God speaks to him after this event are the same words He speaks to him in Genesis chapter 12. Look up into the sky. See, God uses language, and He uses language in Scripture to introduce us to something and to bring us back to it. He brings Abraham back those 25 years. What was that conversation? This is like Scripture, like, God, why do you leave some stuff out? Right? Because the conversation back down the mountain, what was that like? Abraham to his son, can you believe that just happened? Dad, there was no way that ram was up there when we got up there. But what about this part of the conversation? Son, you know what this means, don't you? What, Dad? This is not just my promise, son. It's your promise too. Genesis chapter 23, Sarah dies. Genesis chapter 24, Abraham sends out servants to find Isaac a wife. this dream, this promise, was never only going to be contained with Abraham. It was going to go forth from Abraham. And so God, in this moment that we would consider the most severe test ever known, God doesn't do it to see if Abraham's still on board. He doesn't do it to try to trick him, to try to make him think that he doesn't have what it takes, whatever. There came a time where this promise had to be reestablished, and he reestablishes it. Came a time where God wanted to reinforce, this is still for you and your family. This is still from me. And Isaac needed to get it. And my, did he get it. Dad was going to sacrifice me because God directed him to do that. And yet God provides. That mountain, Moriah, the Lord will provide. It's interesting, the promise at this altar doesn't just change Isaac. It's the first time that mountain's mentioned in Scripture. Until David buys a threshing floor and God tells him to build an altar. And when David, now we're forward more generations, David buys the threshing floor, offers another sacrifice to the Lord, an altar there. Fast forward, the temple is built by his son on Mount Moriah. When Jesus dies on the cross, the veil of the temple, which would have been there on Mount Moriah, gets torn and the separation between us and God eliminated forever. Where does it start? Hundreds of years before, when Abraham builds an altar of trust. It changes him. It changes Isaac. It changes the mountain. Altars alter everything. In the past, especially to this congregation, I've also dubbed this as the dream altar. That in every one of our lives, we have dreams. We have things maybe we felt like God had promised, or directions we felt like God had told us to go in. And time has a way of dulling our hearing. Time has a way of diminishing our passion. Time has a way of creating doubt. And God creates moments for trust altars. Where we say, okay, God, then if this is yours, bring it back to life. If it's not, can you trust me and say, if God doesn't resurrect it up, it needs to stay dead. What you thought was going to be the provision, that your answer, God has another one. You don't see it. You didn't see it. You've been on the mountain for a while. You've checked the bushes. There ain't nothing there. I'm just telling you, if he doesn't raise that back up, there's something else there. Placing a dream on this altar is an act of worship that bridges the gap between our limits and God's limitless power to do what he's promised to do. Building a trust altar is an act of worship. It's an act of movement, and it creates momentum for the future, not just our future, but for the future of everyone that follows us. So I forced myself to think through how do you build trust altars? The first thing I thought about is to not avoid the altar moment. but to embrace it as a necessary moment. I don't like change. It's interesting. A lot of people in the current first service like change. Do you like change? If you like change, raise your hand. Like change. Okay, you don't like change, raise your hand. Much more honest group. Thank you very much. It's great to have honest people at church. Man, we might have had just a very adventurous group in the first service. I'm not big on it myself. I think change is overrated. I started thinking about it. I don't know how old this shirt is. I have old clothes, I have old cars. I like, my most consistent character trait is consistency. I'm loyal to a fault. I'm going to be the same guy standing up here now. I was the same guy 12 years ago when I stood in the gym at the elementary school. I'm going to be the same guy eating hot chicken with you on a Tuesday afternoon as I'm going to be at a fancy restaurant. I'm just who I am. Hey, listen, if you've been coming for a little while and you're just trying to wait to see if he shows a better self, I'm sorry. This is all you get. So the idea of embracing change moments is not anything that I'm good at. Abraham went the whole direction to that mountain knowing he was heading for a change moment. If we will learn in the transitions of our life to embrace those moments, we will build altars. Because the only place that the divine is going to intersect in the human with that is going to be at an altar of worship. Embracing hardship. And embracing hardship in worship at an altar invites the limitless God into very limited circumstances. If we're afraid of it and we run from it, where is the embrace? The second thing that occurred to me on building a trust altar is that when you get there, do what God asks. All along, God had opportunity to take Abraham out of the most severe of this. What was the emotion of tying up your son like? Surely on the way up, he could have showed him the ram. There was no bargaining. We have no record of any bargaining with Abraham and God. It was what it was. This is what God asked him to do. He still did it in the same kind of trust he did when he left his servants and said, the boy and I are going to go over here and worship. And when we're finished, we're going to come back. See, when you enter into a difficult circumstance where your trust needs to be reestablished and reinforced, it's not the time to bargain. By experience, bargaining with God and winning is a loss. Come on now. If you've walked with God any length of time, you've done your bargaining. And there's been times in that bargaining God's giving you your way. But can I tell you, it's always a loss. A loss of what? A loss of what more he wanted to do. He will work at our level of pain, it seems sometimes. And when we've said we've had enough, sometimes he stops. But I always wonder what would have been on the other side if I'd have kept going. Building a trust altar, go ahead and build it. Go ahead and put the thing up there. Life's going to come either way. Whether it dies or whether it lives, life's coming because that's what God does. God does life. So stop bargaining and start doing. And when you do, then the third one is to listen for his voice and look for his provision. Amen. What are you saying, God? What do you got, God? if there's something else, show me. I mean, Abraham was fully committed. I mean, Scripture's specific, right? He's fully committed to this thing. The knife is raised, and God stops him. Just got to keep pushing, listening, and looking for God's voice and His provision. Altars. Something that I have felt a personal conviction over lately is about praying on my knees. I know it might sound strange. I think about where I pray and how I pray, and I've got a leather chair in the home office that I like to sit in. And usually it's early in the morning, and my wife doesn't believe in heat, so it's cold. So I'm wrapped in a blanket sitting in a cold leather chair, and that's where I talk with God. And I completely believe in our ability to interact with God anywhere and everywhere, in any setting, and have a conversation with God. I understand that. This is what modern church and modern worship try to introduce to us. But many times we have lost the transcendency of God, in the sense that He is much larger than a friend that we just have a conversation with. See, I can have a conversation with you, and you can have some good ideas, and I can accept those good ideas, and I can ponder the ideas, and we can bat forth the good ideas. But then there's something different when I am engaging a holy God. This becomes less about a conversation and more about hearing. And it's when I hit my knees, there becomes with me a higher recognition of who I'm engaging. And I'm convicted that I don't have enough altars. Plenty of conversations. Not enough altars. Come on up, team. The ripple effect of altars continues to happen. Even when I look at the other altars I was going to preach to you about, which would have left no time for us to experience an altar, by the way. Demonstrate how everything changes around an altar. It's amazing what I went through. We build the altar. God responds to the built altar. Altars are where we engage a holy God. The two people that I spoke with after the first service, both different experiences with the same experience, talked about how an altar, the only interaction they'd ever had even with the Word, was in a church setting where someone was coming to repent. And so what that ended up making it be is everybody would watch someone coming to the altar thinking, what did they do? Altar is just a place where we engage God. So growing up, I understood the front of a church with a platform. I understood it as the altar. I understood that locale as an altar. Altar is a place I go and I meet God. It's the human and the divine coming together. But there was also other places when I was growing up. I turned around and would kneel at my pew. And even though there was plenty of people in the room, I still felt like this was where I was. This is where I was with God. The interesting thing about altars is they can be built anywhere. Any place where I hit my knees to engage a holy God, I have made an altar in that place. So here's a sidebar. Any place you want to change in your life, go there on your knees. It transforms a room with a nondescript, unnamed paint color on the wall into a sanctuary when someone makes an altar? Where do you need God to reestablish, reinforce a promise to you? What has time taken away from that? This morning is a place where you can establish an altar. Whether that be in a moment that your movement takes you to the front of a platform to kneel, whether it takes you to turning around and kneeling at your chair, stand. How you make this altar isn't nearly significant as who you're going to engage at the altar. But it's more than a conversation, folks. It's more than a mouthed prayer. It's engaging a holy God. So, Father, in this room, in this time, Lord, I pray for those that are wrestling. Lord, they're wrestling with something, either something you have asked them to do or some movement you've prodded them to do. I don't know whether it's a relationship to have or not have. Lord, what I do know, Lord, is there's been wrestling, and Lord, you're wanting to lead them to life, and you do that at altars. And so, Father, as the men and women, as students in this room, as many intentionally in a moment make an altar, Lord, let this be said like it was said there on Mount Moriah, Lord, that mountain was renamed as the place that you provide. Lord, let this be its own Mount Moriah today, a place where you provide. So I invite you to come forward, spin at your chair, find and make an altar, someplace where your knees engage God.
Lay it down, lay your heavy burden down. Come, bring it all. There is mercy
couple years ago, I made friends with a Presbyterian pastor in Columbia. His name's Reverend Joe. I met him because he and I did a joint funeral for someone. Walked into the church, and it was gorgeous. Pews, the way the ceiling was done. I mean, you walked in and you just went, you know, it was kind of this really reverent kind of feeling places. I stood there in a moment, he came over next to me, and I said, Pastor, I said, you and I have the same challenge every week, but we have to come at it at different ways. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, look, they have a big cross hanging down over in this, what would be this area. And I said, you walk into your building, and the transcendency of God is present. I mean, you just feel this, it's a sacred space. He said, yeah, it's a sacred space. So your challenge is helping people understand that they can approach a sacred God. Because everything seems very like sit on your hands, right? I said, so our goal as pastors is to help people engage God, and you have, in your space, it seems like God's present. You have to help people reach God. I said, I have the exact opposite challenge. I said, I have a screen hanging where you have a cross. I've got concrete floors and block walls. The ability to touch God seems very easy. There aren't any traditional trappings, if you will. I said, my challenge is to get people to understand when they reach God, they've reached someone holy. That we can come in, we can engage God, but who are we really engaging? Do we feel like we're engaging this transcendent, mysterious, all-inspiring God, or have we gotten a good pep talk, picked up a few pointers, and one about our week? That's not good enough. It's a sanctuary. When we make altars, wherever we make them, we engage a holy God. Not just a God worthy of our praise, but a God who changes everything. And listen, moms and dads, wherever you build altars will have an impact on your family. You build an altar in your home, it's going to be a ripple effect in your home. Ladies, gentlemen, you build an altar in your office, you're going to change. It's going to be a ripple effect, the people around you. We need to build more altars. An elevated place of sacrifice, of worship. It takes movement, but creates momentum. I know I'm going to be praying a lot more on my knees. A lot more on my knees than in my chair. In my chair. If you're a guest with us today, it's been great having you part of our worship time together. Pastor Craig mentioned a connect card. We try to let people be as anonymous as they want to be, as long as they want to be. But every conversation of relationship generally ends up beginning, hello, my name is. And that's kind of what that card is. It's kind of your permission to us to tell us your name so we can begin relationship. And so right outside these double doors, Big C, Gene and I, this service, we'll be out there for a little bit, and we'd love to get a chance to meet you. The congregational meeting, it's open to anybody, but really it's a finance meeting. Why are we doing it on Sunday after church? Well, it's spring break when we worked this out, and so we did it Sunday night last week, and some were able to come, and others we try to make it as convenient as possible for you to kind of get an update of where we sit financially, where's the progress in the new building, where that sits financially. To hear it in a setting where you can ask questions, and so that's what that's about. So when I do the benediction, guests, we'd love to get a chance to meet you. I want them to stay friends with Pastor Jen, so if you've got kids checked in, love if you're going to come back to the meeting, I'd love for you to get your kids and bring them. It's short unless you ask 100 questions, all right? So it'll be a relatively short meeting, probably 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So you can bring your kids on in here as well. If you'll stand for the benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May make his face to shine on you, be gracious to you, and grant you peace. And you're rising up, and you're laying down, and you're going out and coming in, both now and forevermore. God bless you. I hope to see you next week for the part of the message I couldn't preach today. On altars, alter everything.